Hello, and we are live. I feel like I'm presenting the news with the countdown music and serious, the counting down. So anyway, here we are today, and we are with Marissa Ellis.
Hi everyone, lovely to be.
Hi, Marissa. Thanks for joining us today. And before we get into it, I want to welcome all of you. It might be no one, but hopefully you'll be joining us for the recording. So if you are joining us for the recording, then hello. And a quick disclaimer. So whenever I ask people about introversion and how it affects them, people always say, well, it's a spectrum and we're not the same. So I've even prepared a quick disclaimer. And the disclaimer says, remember that introversion varies widely among individuals. And so everything we talk about today may or may not apply directly to you, but obviously we're trying to bring you some valuable perspectives. So please bear in mind, you might be in a different area of the spectrum, but that's why we've got 5 days of events and not just one. So I'd like to introduce our guest today, which is Marissa. And Marissa Ellis is the strategist. She's an advisor. She's a speaker. She's a best-selling author. She's got over 20 years of experience. And she's the founder of Diversity, which is an inclusion consultancy, which is on a mission to help organizations innovate more inclusively. And from running inclusive leadership programs, developing organization-wide diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies, to helping digital product teams design for diversity, Marissa's work centers on creating more human-centric workplaces that get better results. So Marissa, welcome.
Thank you very much. Lovely to be here.
Yes, indeed. Lovely to have you. And just to start with, I know I've prepared some questions, but I'm going to just jump around a bit because you said you were happy to freestyle.
Absolutely.
And brilliant. And a little while ago, I put a few posts on LinkedIn about how there ought to be more inclusion for introverts. And you reached out and you DM'd me and you said, this is such an important topic. So I'd love to hear, first of all, what does introversion mean to you and why is this topic so important to you, Marissa?
Yeah, great question. And, when I saw your article, I just thought, yes, this needs to be talked about more. I guess let's start with how I think of introversion, and then I'll tie it back to the topic of inclusion. So for me, introversion is really where you get your energy from. So I think as an introvert, I sort of think of it almost as your kind of internal battery. So what helps you charge your battery? Is it being by yourself, having quiet times in quiet settings, or is it being in large groups in highly stimulating environments? Does your internal battery recharge or does it drain? And I think introverts tend to be more inward focused. They're often reflecting more deeply on their thoughts and their feelings. But I also think there are lots of misconceptions about introversion. The point about the spectrum that you made earlier is absolutely spot on. And I think we're all unique beings. And I don't think anyone can be defined by their introversion or their extroversion. I think there's a whole host of factors that influence who we are as individuals. And it's also interesting to look at how maybe our kind of inward and outward focus varies over the years as we sort of go through different generations. So babies, when they're first born, are totally inward focused. It may not feel like it as a new parent, but babies who, when they're first born, they sleep for 18 hours a day. They're totally in kind of inwardly focused. As you become toddlers, we suddenly start exploring the world and we're suddenly looking outwards much more. As teenagers, we can suddenly become a bit more inward, reflecting more on our thoughts. As adults, we grow in confidence and our kind of place in the world, and we have more of an outward focus. And then as we age, sometimes people become a bit more kind of inward focused, as maybe they lose some of their sort of maybe hearing or sight or physical abilities. People could become a bit more kind of inward focused. So I do think the spectrum's important, and the context and the situation and even where we are, how old we are in our kind of life journey is really important. So one thing I would say is not to be defined by introversion, but to kind of recognize the differences between, the kind of commonly associated differences between introversion and extroversion. It was really interesting. So I had a stock images of introvert. and it came up and it said shy and lonely. And I just thought, these are some real misconceptions, because as an introvert, it doesn't mean that you're shy or lonely. These are just some of the misconceptions. Also, there's some misconceptions about introverts not having social skills, not being able to handle themselves in social situations. So I think it is a useful attribute, and I certainly have found it helpful for myself to recognise that I am an introvert, and therefore create space for myself and know what I need to work on, and kind of recognise the situations that I thrive in. But I certainly would never like to define myself as that.
And Marissa, sorry, your sound, the last few things you said, I couldn't hear you. So I'm not sure if you're a little bit far away from the mic or... that's much better now when you're closer.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay, well, let me zoom in a bit.
Yes, yeah. So perhaps if you wouldn't mind repeating the last couple of things you said.
I think I was just talking about some of the misconceptions around introversion, and how shyness and loneliness are sometimes associated with introversion. I did a search in an image library for introvert, and it came up with shy and lonely as kind of descriptors, and I just thought, but they're completely different things, but there is this kind of association, and I think that sometimes introverts aren't lacking social skills. They're not necessarily shy. It's a sort of a different thing. So I think it's important to kind of acknowledge your preference, if you like, and acknowledge where you might sit on the spectrum, potentially under different contexts, different situations, because I think it's helpful to help you put yourself in situations where you'll thrive and figure out where your areas for growth are. But I don't think it's that helpful to really kind of define yourself by, your introversion or your extroversion, because I think we're all kind of rounded human beings, and there's lots of different factors that influence who we are.
Thank you. And I felt that was really interesting what you said about age, and almost as we come back full circle, as we go from babies to aging, and how we become insular, more outward focused, and then more insular again. So that was really interesting. So you have your diversity and inclusion consultancy, Diversity, and how much of the work that you do is around creating, I guess more conducive environments for introverts, or at least raising awareness among organizations of what they can do to support introverts?
Yeah, I mean, I'll come back to your kind of original question about the kind of the connection between introversion and inclusion. And I think the general principle of the work that we do, and so many others do in this space, is creating workplaces where everyone can thrive. And that really does mean everyone. And I don't think it's that helpful to kind of define people by single characteristics, because we are all unique and we are all made up of, there's so many different factors that influence us. And I think introversion and extroversion is just one other kind of facet of people's preferences at work. And I think what's really important is creating work environments where everyone can thrive. And part of that is recognizing different preferences, different needs, and different situations that different people will respond in, essentially. So I guess much like other minority groups, introverts often face societal biases and misconceptions. So extroversion is frequently, certainly in the Western world, it's often seen as this kind of ideal, leading to this perception that introverts are potentially less capable leaders, less able team players. And I think this parallels kind of broader societal challenges where minority groups have to work just that little bit harder to prove their worth and their capabilities in environments that essentially aren't designed for them. And I think recognizing and addressing these biases is essential for creating more inclusive and equitable, workplaces, societies, where all different leadership styles or kind of personal characteristics are valued.
So important. So important. Go ahead, Marissa.
I was just going to say that I think extroverts are often seen to be kind of charismatic and visionary and bold and decisive. and whereas introverts are maybe seen as shy and retiring and less capable. And I think there's something really important about kind of changing that narrative, because there are so many highly capable introverted leaders and, you know, team members out there that where does this narrative come from, and how can we kind of let it? So I think there's something about sort of challenging stereotypes as we move forward to try and create more inclusive workplaces, and starting to kind of value a little bit more around what sort of traits, if you like, that are typically associated with introversion can bring.
Yeah, so important. And it's interesting because as I was doing a bit of research for this series, and I've been happy to pronounce my being an introvert, you know, for many years. And I was looking, and I read something that said that there are 4 types of introvert. And the first one is what they call the social introvert. And these are the people who don't particularly enjoy socializing. And then the thinking introvert, you've got the anxious introvert, and then you've also got the restrained introvert. And just hearing those 4 categories made a lot more sense to me, why people were often quick to say, well, I'm an introvert, but don't assume I'm shy, or I'm an introvert, but I love socializing, provided I keep my energy up. And I think the more perhaps that those 4 different categories are shared, then I think people will kind of move away from, oh, introvert, you must be shy, you must be anxious, you must be all these different things, because of course, you know, it's not the case. So then that could help in the workplace as well to kind of make it easier for introverts to be successful.
100%. There's a couple of things that made me think. One is around this idea of uniqueness, and, you know, don't define me by one word kind of thing. And I think it's also about creating, sort of recognizing the strengths of introverts. So it's almost like extroverts is the sort of the default. They're these kind of positive descriptors, whereas the introverts, it's I'm either shy or socially, you know, find social situations challenging. Whereas actually, let's flip the narrative and let's talk about some of the sort of the skills and some of the kind of the natural tendencies that introverts have that maybe bring real strength and value to, especially if we're talking about workplace situations. So potentially being really good at listening, being really good and aware of what other people are saying, what other people might be thinking and not saying. I think introversion can sometimes be associated with more empathetic leadership, more empathetic relationships, which is hugely valuable for business. There can be something about resilience potentially, not all the time. And I really hate the idea of kind of pigeonholing, because it kind of goes against. But I do think there is something about sort of flipping the narrative to be more positive, and I think drawing out some of the strengths. So, for example, we do a lot of the work that we do is about training organizations and training leaders to become more inclusive leaders. And I think if you sort of think about the kind of the historical sort of the mold for success of what a leader should look like, it's, you know, it's this kind of command and control, this very sort of assertive, visionary, you know, it's this kind of extrovert mold, if you like. But inclusive leadership is really about creating an environment where all team members can feel valued and heard and empowered. And it's actually critical in a workplace today where we're leading kind of much more diverse teams. The kind of world is becoming more kind of smaller as we're kind of connecting globally. It's really, really important to kind of bring everyone's voice in and to be able to leverage those diverse perspectives. And actually, there's some introverted traits that are really great for inclusive leadership. So, and there may be things that maybe some extroverts find challenging. So, for example, as I talked about, you know, listening skills, deep thinking, being able to kind of naturally foster this culture of empathy and understanding, fundamental for inclusivity. Building deep relationships, really understanding others and putting yourself in other people's shoes rather than it kind of the focus always being on you. I think sometimes extroverted leaders are so happy being kind of center stage that they remain center stage, whereas actually a leader's job is to almost set the stage and then get out of the way so that the team can perform and the team can kind of put the show on. And I think introverted leaders can kind of lean into that and delegate and give other people opportunities, and ultimately create a more empowering and inclusive workplace for everyone. I think the other thing that introverted leaders can bring is that this understanding of some of the challenges that some introverts face. And I think inclusive leadership is all about recognizing difference and providing support and guidance and different options so that everyone can thrive. So, for example, in a meeting, it's not just about the loudest voice. It's giving people the opportunity to maybe share things anonymously or share their thoughts in written form afterwards. And I think that's where the kind of introverted leader can kind of play into their strengths. I think it's really important, not just in the context of introversion, but in the context of life, is to kind of lean into who you are and be the best you can be, not try and make yourself to be someone you're not. I think that's kind of where we're falling short sometimes in the workplace, where people are sort of trying to become something that they're not. And I think that's emotionally exhausting and detracts from that person actually being able to perform at their best. I do think there are areas of leadership that maybe some extroverts find easier, and for introverts it's about thinking of growth opportunities and areas to work on. And we're all growing and we're all learning, and I think it's really important to always be trying to improve yourself, and by the more you know yourself, the more you can improve yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're saying that managers need to be more cognizant of the skills that introverts have and the bias that they might have towards extroversion. And interesting, I'm not sure if you've come across the research of Adam Grant, and he paired, I think it was an introverted leader with an extroverted team and an extroverted leader with an introverted team, and found that those two combinations can work really well. Because if you've got an introverted leader, they are, thinking things through, but then they allow the team to go off and do their own thing. Whereas when you have that extroverted leader who's very much, they want things to be the way that they want them to be. If you've got a more introverted group that are working with that leader, they are happy, to put any thinking in, but they enjoy having that direction from that leader. So I'm not sure if that's anything you've ever kind of encountered yourself.
I mean, I think for me, it's actually about difference. I think it's recognizing that high-performing teams bring to their collective capability. Together, you cover all bases, and you can, difference comes in all shapes and sizes. And introversion and extroversion is kind of one dimension of that. And I think having people with traits and skills typically associated with extroversion and people with traits and skills typically associated with introversion in the same team, collectively, you've got to find common ground, and you've got to find ways of working together. And this is the challenge of inclusion, right? It's much easier to have an inclusive team if everyone's the same. Hey, we all just naturally get on, and we just can read each other's minds, and we all think the same. But we've got huge gaps because we're only covering this kind of quadrant over here, and all of these other things are kind of left untouched. So I think ultimately it's about leveraging those differences and kind of giving credit and recognition for it, as opposed to having this idea that one is better than the other. And I think that's also sometimes where we sort of fall short in terms of. I hear from a lot of introverts, they're not feeling like they're getting the credit and the recognition, and they feel like it's the loudest voices and the more dominant characters who tend to be the extroverts.
Yeah, and given what you're saying just there, I put a post up last week about, because I'd surveyed my audience to see what sort of challenges they faced, and that was how I chose the themes for the 5 days of this week. And a couple of comments that came up were that my contributions aren't taken as seriously, or being credited to a louder person who agreed with what I'd said in a quieter way. And my communication style is sometimes construed as weak, fragile, or, on the other hand, right, you can't win. So you're seen as rude or aloof, standoffish. And then this person said leaders have tried to coach them to grow into a more introverted style. And then others have said, people say that I'm not engaged or I'm not knowledgeable because I don't kind of jump in with loads of comments, sort of spontaneous comments, the way that some extroverts do. So bearing in mind what we've just talked about, if you had to address those comments, if somebody came to you and said, well, look, Marissa, this is what I'm finding as an individual in the workplace, what would you say to them? Like, obviously there's an aspect of what the organization can do, which we've talked about and we'll kind of sum up again as we come to the end, but also as an individual, if you had to give them, right, here's 3 kernels of advice for you, this is what I'd suggest that you do to try and help yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I'd say is just to sort of recognize that it can be frustrating when your contributions are overlooked and credited to someone else. And it can be really disheartening when your communication style is kind of misinterpreted or misunderstood. So just to kind of acknowledge that what they're feeling is completely valid and they're not alone. You know, many people experience it, because I think, you know, that's almost a demonstration of empathy, which actually is underused in the workplace. And the power of it is just to make people feel seen and heard. You know, just seen and heard. I haven't fixed a problem, but you know what? I feel, you know, someone feels seen and heard, and they just feel validated and like, okay, you know, my experience matters. I matter. So that in itself is a kind of starting point. But what can they actually do, and what can the organization do? I mean, I think you have to sort of lean into your strengths. And I think they say that there's 2 types of people in the world: people who know themselves and people who think they know themselves. So the kind of general message is we all think we know it. We all think we know ourselves. But the truth is we can all get to know ourselves better, and time spent really understanding who you are, what your appetite to risk is, where your strengths are, what situations make you feel uncomfortable, what makes you feel uncomfortable, what kinds of interactions are you best at, what, you know, everything about, you know, your kind of behaviors, preferences, needs, style in the workplace can help you improve upon those things. So I think if you really understand yourself, you can do a whole host of things. You can lean into developing yourself. So I think we need to be open to growth. So if someone is sort of saying, oh, you know, your communication style isn't landing, essentially, instead of saying, well, this is how I communicate and that's just how I am and that's the end of it, I do think there's something about being open-minded and saying, well, do you know what? Communication is actually one of the most important things in life and in business. And even the greatest communicators in the world are tuning the way they communicate, whether it's their presence or the words they use or the clarity or the tone or the timing or the channel or the, you know, there's so many different facets to communication. I think that there is something about thinking, well, what can I do to improve the way I communicate without doing a disservice to who I am, without trying to do it in a way that's not authentic to who I am. So you can always improve, but don't try and do it in a way that kind of leans into an extrovert style. Do it in a way that kind of leans into who you are. If you know yourself, you can assert your contributions. You can start to kind of advocate for some of the strengths that introverts bring. You can also leverage, maybe if you're better in written communication rather than kind of speaking up in a meeting, you can maybe share your contributions in a kind of more potentially articulate and cohesive form afterwards. You can also, if you don't feel that your contributions are being recognized at a meeting, you can kind of assert your contributions, maybe afterwards just highlighting in an email the point that you made. The other thing you can do, this is a strategy that was deployed by President Biden's aides. This was specifically actually focused on women and ensuring that women were getting credit for their ideas. They adopted a strategy called amplification. And really simple, if someone shared an idea, then someone else would just give that person credit for it. So that it was clear that idea came from this person, even though someone else kind of went off and started sort of taking the idea on as their own. And I think you can find supportive colleagues. You know, if you're getting this kind of criticism or feedback and it's happening on a regular basis, well, find some people you can trust in your organization and maybe share some of your concerns and ask them to maybe back you or ask them for feedback so that you can try and both assert yourself and get the credit you deserve, but also recognize where you might be able to improve.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point as well. This idea that maybe you're not somebody who shines in a large meeting with many people, but it doesn't mean that you can't win people over one by one, or have those one-to-one conversations where you explain to people, well, this is the personality that I have. These are the situations in which I thrive. This is how I do my best work, so that those people will be advocating for you or recognizing you, even when there are others who are kind of mistakenly believing that you're aloof or you're too quiet or whatever it might be. So yeah, I think that that's really important. And as you say, asking for feedback, making sure that you do all your planning and preparation beforehand, so important. And I think those are quite doable things. So let's say that you've got somebody who's doing a lot of that, but they're still feeling a bit stymied by the environment that they're in. So what advice would you perhaps give to, maybe it's because I've had CFOs, CEOs and so on come to me and say, well, we've got 50-60% introverts in our company, we're a tech company, we've got lots of people who are coding and so on. We really want to make it an environment where the introverts here can thrive. So we want you to come along and do a keynote, or work with us on inclusive leadership on this. So what would you be saying to those sorts of organizations in terms of how they can start to make their workplace more introvert friendly?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a whole host of things. I think the headline is that it's leaning into recognizing different preferences and creating an environment where people can work in a way that suits them. That's the kind of crux of it. But in order to do that, there are a number of things you can do. So one is increasing awareness of different communication styles. So one is the theory of different preferences for communication styles, but the other is actually people who are working together really sharing and doing this in a structured way, so that they're kind of sharing in a sort of set format their preferences, their needs, their strengths, so that people can really get to know their colleagues better. Because if you understand that your colleague is introverted, or maybe your colleague has a neurodivergent condition, and if you distract them by asking them a question, it's going to take them half an hour to kind of get back in the zone of where they were. If you really understand who you're working with, you can help to create a more inclusive environment for your colleagues. So there's something around kind of understanding each other better. This is kind of the starting point. I once did this really fascinating, I was going to say experiment, but it was more of an exercise, where we were in a room and all the introverts were kind of self-nominated themselves to go to one side of the room, and the extroverts nominated themselves to go to the other side of the room. And each team, if you like, was asked to come up with their ideal social, like work social. And the introverts gathered and they chatted, and the extroverts gathered and they chatted. And at the end of this kind of part one of this exercise, everyone was really happy, and they thought that they'd come up with this great social. And the introverts presented their social to the extroverts, and the extroverts looked a bit disappointed, and the extroverts presented their ideas to the introverts, and the introverts looked horrified. And it kind of made the point that the extroverts didn't really want to play games and have some quiet conversations and eat some nice foods, and the introverts did not want to sing karaoke in front of their colleagues. So bringing it back to the question about kind of workplaces, is you've got to create, for socials, you can't just, it's not always about beer and pizza. You've got to think about the vegetarians, and think about the people who maybe find it slightly more awkward to kind of just approach people and break into conversation with them, and create just different environments with different people to thrive, and make it easy for people to make connections with each other. I think for the people who struggle a bit with the networking, create like a meet the CEO or a environment where you can ask questions, or you can meet people in like we once did this thing called coffee roulette, where you just randomly had a coffee with someone on Zoom. But it's just trying to find ways of serendipitously creating connections between colleagues that's not reliant on someone who's an extrovert just kind of going out and naturally. So if you can make that part of the way your organization works, you then you kind of give everyone a little bit of a lift up, because it's those connections that make people go, oh, I didn't realize your department was doing that. Oh, but we're doing this, and together we could, this is how businesses function. It's those conversations that, where people kind of draw connections and maybe help each other solve problems or improve time to market, or whatever it may be. So there's one thing about kind of understanding each other. There's another around creating an environment of personalization, and then that then goes into the way your team works. So we do a lot of work looking at meetings. How are meetings functioning? Are they just about the loudest person who speaks? Is there opportunity for everyone to talk? Do you kind of go around the room and invite everyone to speak who wants to? Do you give time for anonymous contributions? Do you do a bit of a check-in to see how people are really feeling, to kind of start to build slightly closer connections between the people in the room? So I think there's an awful lot that organizations can do, and it does often fall on the leaders, and just sort of thinking that one size fits all is where a lot of leaders go wrong, because that one size typically doesn't suit the introvert.
Yeah, how interesting. And I know early on in my career, when I was working in consulting, I had a manager that just made the assumption that because I wasn't speaking up very much, I didn't have a lot to say. And that was, quite a while ago, but it's still sad to see that those assumptions are still being made very much, even, where people have had perhaps training on inclusive leadership, or they understand about neurodivergence and the amount of diversity that there is in the workplace today. So those are some really solid tips and insights as to how companies, organizations can make places a little bit easier for introverts to flourish. And I've done quite a bit of work with organizations in Asia, for example, where there are a lot more introverts, or where they're very mixed internationally, and you've got a lot of introverts who are perhaps from Asia working on teams with people from the US. So the things that you said about, for example, allowing anonymous feedback, or sort of going around one by one and asking people if they have anything to share, all those sorts of opportunities for people really do make a big difference. So we're coming to a close, really. So I'd love to ask you if there's anything you would like to promote or to share, or initiatives that you've got going on, or if you'd like people to reach out to you, what's the best way to do that?
Sure. So specifically on the topic of introversion, there's a nice blog on the Diversity website, which I think you'll be able to share the link to when you collate the outputs from this week. So it's a nice kind of summary of some of the things we've been talking about, 11 things that all introverted leaders should know. So I think it's some really kind of practical insights. We did mention a little bit there around this difference between Western and Eastern cultures. And I do think when you're thinking about inclusion, you should always be thinking about the lens with which you're seeing things. And I think this idea of the extroverted leader being the best it's a Western ideology. I think in some Eastern cultures, actually, that some of the kind of more reserved behaviors are actually very well kind of revered and respected. So I think, I do think that's an important point. I think your point about judgment was also really interesting. And I think it's all very well to have been on inclusive leadership training, but being an inclusive leader is something else. And part of that is about it's very difficult not to judge, because we are judgmental. That's part of who we are as humans, but recognizing when you are judging. And actually, if you're thinking someone's got nothing to contribute because they're not speaking up, that's your failing as a leader, because everyone in your team has got something to contribute. You just need to create the environment where they're able to do that, I think. And if they're still not able to contribute, well, then you've got an issue. But you've got to create the environment where they're able to contribute in a way that suits them. So if you want to know more about specifically introversion and leadership, there's a really nice blog on the website. If you're interested more generally in terms of the work that we're doing at Diversity, our kind of flagship program is our inclusive leadership program. We also do a really lovely course on psychological safety, which is it's really kind of game changing in terms of helping people bring a little bit more intelligence and kind of insight in terms of the way that they're leading their teams. So I think those are kind of two of the kind of main things I'd recommend to people on the kind of HR side who are listening in. For people who are listening in, who are working more on the product side, last year we collaborated with about 20 experts from around the world to create the Inclusive Innovation Playbook. And this is all about building digital products and services with diversity in mind. So thinking about who your audience is and catering for people with different needs and different backgrounds and different preferences. And it's completely free. And we just want people to start using it and changing the way that they innovate, the way that they build products and solutions. So I highly recommend you check those out. You can go to diversity.com to access all of these things. So that's diversity with an L instead of a T, so diversity. Or you can catch me on LinkedIn. And I think Shola will be able to share my LinkedIn profile. So always happy to connect with new people and foster new collaborations. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for all those insights that you've shared. They've been really helpful. And I'm looking forward to putting the insights and the summary booklet together and really kind of giving people some serious nuggets that they can go away and act upon. And anybody who is looking at this, watching this, feel free to go to sholakaye.com/introverts, and you can get the link to the recordings of all 5 sessions from this week. And you can also get that summary document, which we'll put out probably mid next week. So once again, thank you so much, Marissa, for your time and for your insights. And I hope you people get in touch with Marissa. Diversity is doing some great work. The blog post sounds really interesting as well. So thank you, Marissa.
Thank you so much for having me. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week talking to some others about this really fascinating topic.
Brilliant. Take care. Thanks, Marissa. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Bye.